Elijah Kane never wanted to be a hero, but when systemic racism tore his community apart, he became the Avenger no one saw coming. Armed with military skills and unrelenting determination, he strikes fear into the oppressors while unraveling a conspiracy that could destroy everything. Will he triumph, or will the weight of justice crush him? Elijah Kane stepped off the Greyhound bus, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The familiar Atlanta heat wrapped around him like a smothering blanket, but it wasn't the weather that made his chest heavy, it was the sight of his old neighborhood. Once a vibrant hub of black culture and community, it now looked like a shadow of its former self. Boarded-up storefronts lined the streets where mom-and-pop shops had thrived. The kids who once played basketball at the corner court were now replaced by teenagers loitering in gangs, their laughter replaced with watchful silence. Elijah's boots hit the cracked pavement as he made his way to his family's house, a modest bungalow that seemed to be the only one still standing with fresh paint and a tended lawn. The sight brought a bittersweet smile to his lips. His sister, Lena, always had a way of holding things together, no matter how bad it got. When he knocked, the door flew open, and Lena stood there, her face a mixture of relief and surprise. "Elijah!" she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug. "It's been too long." "Too long," Elijah agreed, his voice gravelly. He pulled back to look at her. "You've been holding down the fort." "I had to," she said, glancing past him at the street. "It's not safe anymore, Eli. Not like it used to be." Inside, Elijah met Jamal, Lena's 16-year-old son. The boy was tall and lanky, with wide eyes that tried to hide the weariness of growing up too fast. They shook hands, and Jamal offered a shy smile. "You're the soldier," Jamal said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Mom talks about you all the time." Elijah chuckled. "Is that right? Well, I'm just your uncle now. No more battles for me." But that lie wouldn't hold for long. Later that evening, Elijah sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea and listening as Lena spoke about the neighborhood's decline. "The Dominion," she said, her voice low as if the walls had ears. "They've been terrorizing folks. Pushing people out of their homes, burning down businesses. And the cops? They don't do a damn thing. Some of them are in on it." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had heard of the Dominion during his time overseas, an underground network of white supremacists, but he hadn't realized their grip had reached his doorstep. As Lena continued, a sudden noise interrupted them, a car screeching down the street. Elijah's sharp instincts kicked in. He turned to see a group of young black men running from a squad car. The officers inside shouted threats, drawing their weapons as the boys scattered. "Get inside," Elijah said to Lena and Jamal, his voice calm but firm. "They're just kids." Lena protested, "Inside. Now." Lena hesitated but obeyed, pulling Jamal with her. Elijah stayed on the porch, watching as the officers caught one of the boys and threw him against the hood of the car. The boy cried out in pain, but the officers didn't stop. Elijah's hands balled into fists. Memories of combat flooded his mind, the helpless faces of civilians caught in war zones, the cries of those who couldn't defend themselves. The boys' screams echoed down the street, and Elijah knew, in that moment, he couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just a homecoming. This was the beginning of a war he hadn't planned to fight. Elijah couldn't shake the images from the night before, the boys' cries, the indifference on the officers' faces, and the way the neighbors had simply closed their blinds, too afraid to intervene. His years in the military had taught him how to suppress anger, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield in a foreign land, this was home. The next morning, he joined Lena at the breakfast table, where Jamal was scrolling on his phone, his face tight with frustration. "What's got you all worked up?" Elijah asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Same old stuff," Jamal said, tossing his phone down. "They arrested Marcus last night, the kid they grabbed outside. He didn't even do anything." Lena sighed. "Marcus's mom came by this morning. She's beside herself. They're charging him with resisting arrest and some nonsense about assaulting an officer." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "Let me guess, he doesn't have a lawyer." Lena shook her head. "You know how it is. They'll railroad him like they do everyone else." Elijah set his mug down with a thud. Not if I can help it. Later that day, Elijah walked to the local precinct. The building was a stark, imposing structure with peeling paint and windows that seemed to glare down at him. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and unwelcoming. At the front desk, a burly officer eyed him suspiciously. "Can I help you?" The officer asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm here about Marcus Green," Elijah said, his voice steady but firm. "I want to know why he's being held." The officer smirked. "And you are?" "A concerned citizen." The officer leaned forward, his smirk turning into a sneer. "Concerned citizens should mind their own business. Now, if you don't have a reason to be here, I suggest you leave." Elijah's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out, his mind already working on his next move. That night, Elijah visited Marcus's mother, Mrs. Green, in her small, cluttered apartment. She was a woman worn down by years of struggle, but her eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope when Elijah knocked on her door. "Elijah Kane," he introduced himself. "Lena's brother." "I know who you are," she said, ushering him in. "Lena talks about you all the time." "I heard about Marcus," Elijah said, sitting on the worn couch. "I want to help." Tears welled in Mrs. Green's eyes. "They're saying he attacked one of those officers." "My Marcus wouldn't hurt a fly." "I believe you," Elijah said. "But the system isn't interested in the truth. We'll have to make them listen." Mrs. Green gave a hesitant nod, clinging to the hope Elijah offered. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his room, staring at the notebook he had started. It was filled with names, addresses, and connections, everything he had learned about the Dominion and their stranglehold on the city. This wasn't just about Marcus. This was about all the families like Mrs. Green's, trapped in a cycle of fear and injustice. Elijah opened his duffel bag and pulled out a small, locked case. Inside was the handgun he had carried during his service, along with a tactical knife and a set of tools he had hoped never to use again. He stared at them for a long moment before closing the case and locking it. If the system wouldn't protect his people, he would. But first, he needed to send a message. Late that night, a car sped down a quiet street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside were two men in plain clothes, Dominion operatives posing as cops. They laughed and joked, oblivious to the shadowy figure following them on foot. When they parked in a secluded lot, the figure struck. The first man didn't even see it coming. A sharp blow to the head rendered him unconscious. The second managed a shout before Elijah's fist silenced him. When they woke, they were tied to a tree, their badges and weapons laid out in front of them. A note was pinned to one man's chest, scrawled in bold letters, "This is your only warning. Leave this neighborhood alone." Elijah disappeared into the night. Knowing this was only the beginning, would you like me to continue with chapter 3 or adjust anything in this chapter? Elijah watched the sunrise from his sister's porch, the city slowly coming alive around him. He'd spent the night in a restless haze, replaying his actions over and over in his mind. The message he sent to the Dominion operatives was clear, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. These men didn't back down, they retaliated, and retaliation came swiftly. Later that afternoon, Lena burst into the house, her face pale and her hands trembling. Elijah was in the kitchen, cleaning up, when she stormed in. "Elijah!" she cried. "They're coming after Jamal." Elijah dropped the dish he was holding. "What happened?" Lena shoved her phone into his hands. On the screen was a video, a group of masked men, one holding a bat and another waving a gun. They stood outside Jamal's high school, threatening students and calling out his name. "Where is he now?" Elijah demanded, his voice sharp. "At school," Lena said, her voice cracking. "I tried to call him, but he's not answering." Elijah grabbed his jacket. "Stay here. I'll bring him back." The schoolyard was eerily quiet when Elijah arrived. Normally, kids would be spilling out of the building, laughing and talking, but today, the air was heavy with tension. Elijah scanned the area, his senses on high alert, then he spotted Jamal, surrounded by a group of older boys. They weren't masked like the men in the video, but their aggressive postures and taunting voices made their intentions clear. "Hey!" Elijah barked, striding toward them. the boys turned, and one of them, a lanky teenager with a sneer plastered on his face, stepped forward. "This your uncle, Jamal?" the boy said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like he wants to play hero." Elijah didn't stop walking until he was right in front of them. His eyes locked onto the lanky boy, and the sneer quickly disappeared. "Let him go," Elijah said, his tone calm but commanding. The boys exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. Finally, one of them muttered, "Let's get out of here. This ain't worth it." As the group scattered, Elijah turned to Jamal. "You okay?" he asked. Jamal nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. "I didn't do anything, Uncle Elijah." I know," Elijah interrupted. "But this is only going to get worse." That night, Elijah sat in his room, staring at the notebook that had become his guide. He flipped through the pages, each name and connection adding fuel to the fire inside him. The Dominion wasn't just a shadowy group operating in the background. They were deeply embedded in the city's power structure: police, politicians, and business owners, all working together to maintain their control. Elijah couldn't take them down alone. He needed a way to strike fear into them, to show the community that they didn't have to live in fear. He needed to become something more. Elijah spent the next few days gathering supplies and transforming his old storage unit into a makeshift base of operations. He pulled out his military gear, camouflage clothing, tactical vests, and night vision goggles. Using spray paint, he darkened the gear, creating a uniform that allowed him to move unseen in the shadows. But it wasn't just about the gear. Elijah also reached out to a trusted friend from his past, a tech-savvy veteran named Malcolm who now ran a repair shop. Malcolm supplied him with cameras, communication devices, and software to monitor the Dominion's activities. "You're really doing this, huh?" Malcolm said, handing over a small drone. "I don't have a choice," Elijah replied. "Well, if you're going to do it right," Malcolm said. "And watch your back." The first mission was simple but symbolic. Elijah targeted a known Dominion safe house, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He waited until nightfall, studying the guards' patterns and counting their numbers. When the time came, Elijah moved like a ghost. He disabled security cameras, slipped past patrols, and planted devices that would expose the warehouse's contents to the public. Inside, he found crates of weapons, documents detailing bribes to city officials, and even maps marking neighborhoods targeted for cleansing. Elijah photographed everything before setting the warehouse on fire. As he disappeared into the night, the flames lit up the sky, drawing attention from news crews and police alike. By morning, the warehouse was headline news, and the Dominion's secrets were exposed. Elijah watched the coverage from Lena's living room, his face expressionless. "The Shadow," the anchor called him. "A vigilante fighting back against injustice." Elijah turned off the TV and looked at Lena and Jamal. "This is only the beginning," he said. The Dominion didn't take the loss of their warehouse lightly. By morning, their operatives were mobilized, combing through the ashes for any clue about the mysterious vigilante. News of the Shadow had spread like wildfire, emboldening the community but enraging the organization. For Elijah, it wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration of war. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, poring over the surveillance footage Malcolm had helped him gather. Each screen displayed a different part of the city, focused on areas the Dominion controlled. "These guys aren't just going to sit back and let this happen," Malcolm said, leaning over Elijah's shoulder. "You hit them where it hurts, and now they'll want blood." "That's the idea," Elijah said, his eyes never leaving the screens. "But we're not letting them take it from innocent people." Malcolm sighed. "This isn't a one-man job, Elijah. You need help." Elijah glanced at him. "Are you offering?" Malcolm chuckled. "I'll keep the tech running, but I'm not suiting up. My war days are over." Elijah nodded. "Then keep your ear to the ground. Let me know if you hear anything big." That night, the Dominion made their first move. A fire broke out at a local community center, a hub for organizing protests and youth programs. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was nearly gone. Onlookers gathered, their faces a mix of despair and anger. Elijah was among them, his hood pulled low over his face. He overheard whispers about the Dominion. How they were sending a message, and how helpless people felt to stop them. That's what they want, Elijah muttered to himself. For us to feel powerless. He slipped away from the crowd and headed to his storage unit. Tonight, the shadow would make his presence known again. Elijah targeted another Dominion safe house, this time an office building in the heart of downtown. It was less about destroying their property and more about gathering intelligence. Inside, he found files detailing their next move, targeted attacks on community leaders and activists. The list included Lena's name. Elijah's heart pounded as he read the details. The Dominion had assigned a team to monitor her. Waiting for the right moment to strike. They're making this personal, Elijah growled, his grip tightening on the papers. He copied the files and set up a series of distractions to draw the guards away. Smoke bombs and fire alarms created chaos, allowing him to escape unnoticed. Back at Lena's house, Elijah wasted no time showing her the files. They're watching you, he said, his voice urgent. You need to stay out of sight for a while. Lena's face went pale as she read the documents. This is insane, Elijah. They're targeting me because of you, aren't they? Because of us, Elijah corrected. They're afraid of what we represent, people who won't back down. But Jamal and I didn't sign up for this. Lena snapped. We just wanted to live our lives, not get caught in some war. Elijah's jaw tightened. I didn't ask for this either, Lena. But they came for us first. And if we don't fight back, they'll just keep coming. Lena looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. What are we supposed to do? Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder. You're going to stay safe. And I'm going to make sure they don't get another chance to hurt anyone. The next night, the Dominion struck again, this time targeting a local activist named Teresa Hill. They firebombed her car and sent her a threatening note. Elijah knew Teresa well. She was a cornerstone of the community, always organizing food drives and protests. He couldn't let them break her spirit. Dressed as the Shadow, Elijah tracked down the group responsible for the attack. They were holed up in an abandoned warehouse, laughing and bragging about their latest hit. Elijah moved silently, disabling their vehicles and cutting off their escape routes. When he was ready, he stepped into the light, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the room. Who the hell are you? One of them demanded, reaching for his gun. Elijah didn't answer. He moved with precision, disarming the man and taking out the others with a combination of military tactics and raw force. When the dust settled, the men were tied up, their weapons confiscated. Elijah left a note pinned to the leader's chest. The people of this city are not your prey. Leave, or face the consequences. As he walked away, the faint sound of police sirens filled the air. Elijah had already sent an anonymous tip, ensuring these men would be caught. The community woke up to another headline about the Shadow, their mysterious protector. Elijah knew he was walking a dangerous line, but the hope in people's eyes made it worth it. Still, the Dominion wasn't finished. And neither was he. The Dominion was no longer content with scare tactics. The losses they had suffered at the hands of the Shadow weren't just blows to their operations, they were cracks in the facade of power they had built over decades. They decided it was time to send a chilling message. One that would break the spirit of the community and end the vigilantes' defiance. Their target wasn't a warehouse or a community leader. It was something far more personal. Elijah was sitting in Lena's living room, reviewing the intel he had gathered. Malcolm had just sent him a fresh batch of encrypted files, and every detail painted a grim picture. The Dominion was increasing their activity, expanding their reach to other cities. They're not backing down, Elijah muttered. Lena walked in, carrying a cup of tea. Neither are you, she said, her voice softer than usual. Before Elijah could respond, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen. It was a message from Malcolm. We've got a problem. They know about your sister. You need to move her now. Minutes later, Elijah was loading Lena and Jamal into his car. They didn't argue this time. The fear in Lena's eyes was too fresh, too raw. Where are we going? Lena asked, clutching Jamal's hand. To Malcolm's, Elijah said, starting the engine. It's the safest place for now. The drive was tense and silent, every shadow on the road feeling like a threat. Elijah kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for signs of pursuit. They arrived at Malcolm's repair shop without incident, but the unease lingered. Malcolm greeted them with a grim expression, leading them through a hidden entrance to a reinforced room in the back. "This place is off the grid," Malcolm said. "No one's getting in without my say-so." Lena looked around, her face pale. "This is no way to live, Elijah." "It's temporary," Elijah promised. "I just need to handle this." "Handle it how?" Lena snapped. "You're one man against an army." Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't. The Dominion wasn't far behind. Late that night, while Elijah was out scouting, Malcolm's shop was attacked. A convoy of black SUVs pulled up, and masked men stormed the building, guns drawn. Malcolm's defenses slowed them down, reinforced doors, cameras, and booby traps, but they didn't stop the assault. Lena and Jamal huddled in the safe room, hearing the chaos outside. Jamal clung to his mother, his small frame trembling. "What if they get in?" He whispered. "They won't," Lena said, her voice trembling. "Your uncle will come back." And he did. Elijah arrived just as the attackers breached the outer defenses. He parked a block away, slipping through the shadows to get a closer look. His heart raced as he saw the SUVs and the heavily armed men surrounding the shop. "This is what you wanted," he muttered to himself, gripping the baton strap to his side. He moved like a ghost, taking out the guards one by one. The element of surprise was on his side, and his military training gave him an edge. By the time the attackers realized they were under siege, Elijah had already cut their numbers in half. The leader of the group, a towering man with a scar running down his face, barked orders, "Find him. He's here somewhere." Elijah used their panic against them, luring them into traps Malcolm had rigged around the shop. By the time the reinforcements arrived, the remaining attackers were either unconscious or fleeing. Elijah stepped into the light, his black gear reflecting the glow of a nearby street lamp. He stared down the reinforcements, his voice cold and unwavering. "Go back to your masters," he said. "Tell them the shadow is watching." Inside the safe room, Lena and Jamal heard a knock. "It's me," Elijah said, his voice muffled through the door. Lena opened it, pulling him into a tight embrace. For the first time, she let the tears fall freely. "They almost got in," she whispered. "But they didn't," Elijah said, his voice firm. "And they won't." The attack on Malcolm's shop sent shockwaves through the community. The Dominion's aggression was escalating, but so was the resolve of the people. Elijah knew he couldn't do this alone anymore. At a late-night meeting with Malcolm and a small group of trusted allies, Elijah made his decision. "It's time to take this fight to the next level," he said. "We're not just going to defend, we're going to dismantle them. Piece by piece." Malcolm nodded. "You're going to need more people. More resources." "And we'll get them," Elijah said. "But it starts with us." The fires of rebellion were burning brighter. The Shadow, once a solitary force against the Dominion, now had the beginnings of a full-fledged resistance on his side. Elijah's eyes no longer saw himself as a lone warrior, but as a leader, someone who could organize and inspire others to take a stand. It was time to make his presence felt in ways the Dominion wouldn't expect. The meeting that night was tense. Elijah, Malcolm, Lena, and a group of local leaders gathered in the back room of a local diner, one of the few places left untouched by the Dominion's reign. The faces around the table were a mixture of fear and determination, but one thing was clear: no one was backing down. "I know you're all scared," Elijah began, his voice steady, "but we've seen what the Dominion is capable of. And they've seen what we're capable of. We've made them bleed, but it's not enough. We need to hurt them where it matters, in their operations." Lena's voice was hesitant, but firm. "You want us to hit their businesses, Elijah? You know the risks." "I know the risks, Lena," Elijah replied, his eyes locked on hers. "But we're running out of time. They'll come for everyone we care about, one by one. We need to show them that we won't be intimidated. This fight isn't just mine anymore, it's ours." Malcolm slid a map across the table, showing the locations of key Dominion assets, warehouses, distribution points, and small offices. "We've identified their weak spots," he said. "With some planning, we can take them out." cause enough disruption to cripple their operations, at least temporarily. Everyone around the table nodded in agreement. Elijah felt a surge of hope, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. These were people who had endured under the Dominion's thumb for far too long. They weren't just afraid anymore, they were angry, and they were ready. Over the course of the next few days, Elijah's team of fighters carried out coordinated strikes across the city. It wasn't just sabotage. It was a message. The Dominion's warehouses were set ablaze, their trucks destroyed in broad daylight, their communication hubs shattered. Each operation was swift, efficient, and precise, leaving the Dominion with no time to retaliate, but with every strike, the shadow of retaliation grew heavier. Elijah knew the Dominion wasn't going to just take the hits, they would come back stronger, more vicious. One evening, as Elijah returned to the hideout after another successful operation, Malcolm's voice crackled over the radio. "Elijah, you need to see this." Elijah's stomach dropped as he picked up the receiver. "What's going on, Malcolm?" "The Dominion knows about your safe house. They've surrounded the block." Elijah's pulse quickened. "How many?" "I don't know, but it's bad. You need to get out of there now." Adrenaline coursing through his veins, Elijah grabbed Lena and Jamal, leading them through the back alley to a hidden exit. His mind raced as he checked the perimeter, scanning for any signs of enemy movement. "They were too close, we have to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. Lena's hand shook as she held Jamal's. "What about the others?" "We'll come back for them," Elijah promised. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. They were running out of time. As they made their way down the alley, a sudden explosion rocked the building behind them, sending debris flying. Elijah didn't flinch. He kept moving, keeping the family close. Another explosion sounded further down the block. The Dominion was closing in, sending waves of destruction to force him into the open, but Elijah had been through worse. He turned to Lena. "Get to the truck. I'll hold them off." Lena's eyes filled with fear. "No, Elijah. We're in this together." He grasped her hand, his grip firm. "I'll be right behind you. Trust me." The truck screeched down the narrow streets, its tires burning rubber as Elijah ran in the opposite direction, drawing the enemy away. He could hear the voices of the Dominion soldiers as they pursued him, but he knew the city like the back of his hand. Elijah darted into an abandoned building, climbing through the upper levels to get the high ground. He knew they would follow, but he had a plan. He set up makeshift traps using the environment, gasoline cans, broken glass, and anything that could be used as a weapon. When the Dominion soldiers burst through the door, they were met with a barrage of fire and chaos. Elijah moved quickly, taking out 2 soldiers with swift strikes, leaving them incapacitated before disappearing back into the shadows. The fight raged for hours, but Elijah never stopped moving. Every time the Dominion's forces closed in, he found another way to escape, to turn the tables, and to send another painful message. Finally, just as dawn began to break, he caught sight of a familiar face, Malcolm, along with a few others from the resistance, arriving to help. "We're here, Elijah." Malcolm shouted, as he and the team stormed the building, guns drawn. Elijah's eyes met his. "It's time to finish this." With a final coordinated strike, the Dominion's hold on the block was broken. The remaining soldiers were captured, and the ones who had been hunting Elijah were forced to retreat. As the dust settled and the sound of sirens filled the air, Elijah took a deep breath, the weight of the battle settling on his shoulders. They had won this round, but the Dominion wouldn't stop. He turned to his team, his allies, and his family. "This is just the beginning." And for the first time in months, Elijah allowed himself a small smile. They were fighting back. And they weren't going to stop. The Dominion was reeling. Their once unquestioned grip on the city was slipping through their fingers. Elijah and his resistance had achieved what many thought impossible, crippling their operations and igniting hope in a community that had long been silenced. But victories often come at a cost, and as the resistance celebrated their latest triumph, Elijah couldn't ignore the growing shadows within himself. The weight of leadership, the danger to his family, and the constant battles were beginning to take a toll. The hideout buzzed with energy. Malcolm and the others were poring over maps and plans, already discussing the next phase of their assault. But Elijah stood apart, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his mind racing. "Hey," Lena said softly, approaching him. She held out a cup of coffee, her expression tinged with concern. "You've been quiet." Elijah took the cup, but his eyes remained distant. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated before answering. "About what comes next. About how far we're willing to go." Lena placed a hand on his arm. "You're doing the right thing, Elijah. You're giving people hope. And putting them in danger," he replied, his voice heavy. "I didn't sign up to lead a war, Lena. I just wanted to protect you and Jamal." "And you are," she said firmly. "But it's bigger than us now. You've inspired people to fight back, to believe that change is possible. Don't lose sight of that." The Dominion wasn't resting either. Behind the scenes, their leaders were regrouping, devising a strategy to regain control. Their new plan wasn't just about brute force, it was psychological. Elijah woke one morning to find posters plastered all over the neighborhood, bearing his face and the words "Wanted, dead or alive." A bounty of $500,000 was offered for information leading to his capture. The posters sent a chilling message: no one was safe. The bounty caused ripples of tension within the resistance. Elijah noticed the subtle changes, conversations that stopped when he entered a room, whispers exchanged in hushed tones. Paranoia began to seep in, eroding the fragile trust that had held them together. At a meeting that evening, Malcolm addressed the group. "The Dominion is trying to divide us. Don't let them. They want us to turn on each other, but we're stronger than that." A young man named Darius, one of the newer recruits, spoke up. "Easy for you to say, Malcolm. You don't have a price on your head. What if someone sells us out? What if someone sells him out?" He gestured toward Elijah. The room fell silent, all eyes on Elijah. "If anyone has doubts about me," Elijah said calmly, "say it now. I won't hold it against you." No one spoke, but the tension lingered. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He paced the small room he shared with Lena and Jamal, his mind replaying the events of the day. He felt trapped, by the walls around him, by the expectations of the resistance, and by the growing doubts within his own heart. He thought back to the days before all this, when he had been just another man trying to make a life for his family. The Dominion had stolen that life from him, but now he wondered if he was losing himself in the fight to get it back. The Dominion struck again the next day, raiding a community center that had been a hub for the resistance. They arrested anyone they found inside, including children. The sight of families torn apart reignited the fire within Elijah. He called an emergency meeting that evening. "They're escalating," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We can't keep playing defense. We need to take the fight directly to them." Malcolm frowned. "You're talking about going after their leadership." "Exactly," Elijah replied. "Cut off the head, and the body dies." The room buzzed with a mixture of fear and excitement. It was a bold move, dangerous, but potentially decisive. As the group planned the operation, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The doubts and fears that had haunted him began to fade. He wasn't just fighting for himself or his family anymore, he was fighting for every person who had suffered under the Dominion's tyranny. But even as they prepared for the final strike, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The Dominion headquarters stood like a fortress at the edge of the city, a grim reminder of their unyielding power. For years, it had been untouchable, the seat of corruption and oppression. Now, it was Elijah's final target. The plan was simple in theory but perilous in execution. A small team of resistance fighters, led by Elijah, would infiltrate the compound under the cover of darkness. Their objective: to expose and dismantle the Dominion's command structure. Once and for all, Elijah stood before his team in the dimly lit hideout, his voice steady but charged with urgency. "This is it," he said, scanning the faces of the men and women who had become his family. "Tonight, we make our stand. Not for revenge, but for freedom. For every life they've destroyed, every family they've torn apart, we end it here." The group erupted in quiet murmurs of agreement, their determination palpable. Lena stepped forward, her gaze locked on Elijah. "We'll be right beside you," she said, gripping his hand. As night fell, the team approached the Dominion compound. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. They moved swiftly, disabling security systems and slipping past patrols with precision born of desperation. Inside the compound, the team split into smaller groups, each assigned a specific task. Elijah and Lena led the main team toward the control room, where vital records and communications could be intercepted. Malcolm and another group targeted the armory, aiming to neutralize the Dominion's weapon supplies. The halls were eerily quiet, the only sound the muffled thud of boots on concrete. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors. Suddenly, a shout rang out, followed by the rapid clatter of gunfire. "They've spotted us." Malcolm's voice crackled over the radio. Elijah's team pushed forward, urgency driving them. They reached the control room and quickly overpowered the guard stationed there. Lena worked furiously at the terminals, downloading files and broadcasting intercepted communications to the public in real time. "We're live," Lena said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "The whole city can see what they've been hiding." Meanwhile, Malcolm's team faced heavy resistance. They fought valiantly, their mission to destroy the armory becoming a desperate battle for survival. Explosions echoed through the compound, shaking the walls and sending shockwaves of fear through the Dominion forces. Elijah and Lena finished their work in the control room and rushed to regroup with the others. The compound was in chaos, Dominion soldiers scrambling to contain the breach, alarms blaring, and fires spreading unchecked. The resistance fighters converged in the central courtyard, their escape route blocked by a heavily armed squad. A fierce firefight erupted, the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of smoke. Amid the chaos, Elijah spotted a figure emerging from the shadows, the Dominion's commander, a man whose cruelty had become legendary. The commander sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really thought you could win? You're nothing but a group of criminals and fools." Elijah stepped forward, his resolve unshaken. "We're not criminals, we're the reckoning you never saw coming." The confrontation was brutal and personal, a clash of wills that symbolized the larger battle. Elijah fought with every ounce of strength he had, fueled by the memories of those who had suffered under the Dominion's reign. As the resistance began to gain the upper hand, the Dominion forces faltered. Their once invincible leader was defeated, and their control over the compound crumbled. Lena grabbed Elijah's arm, her voice urgent. "We have to go now." Reluctantly, Elijah gave the order to retreat. The team escaped into the night, their mission a success but their losses heavy. The next morning, the city awoke to a new reality. The Dominion's secrets had been exposed, their power shattered. For the first time in years, the community dared to hope, but Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. The scars of oppression ran deep, and the road to true freedom would be long and arduous. The sun rose over the city, casting golden light on streets once shrouded in despair. The resistance's victory over the Dominion had sent shockwaves through the community. Families gathered on sidewalks, reading newspapers and sharing news of the rebellion. The city buzzed with cautious hope, like a flickering candle finally shielded from the wind. Elijah sat on the steps of the old church that had served as their headquarters, watching as neighbors and strangers alike began to rebuild. His body ached from the battle, but his mind was sharp, focused on what came next. Lena joined him, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "You should rest," she said softly, though she knew his answer. "Not yet," Elijah replied, his gaze fixed on a group of children playing in the distance. "This isn't the end, Lena. It's just the beginning." She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And we'll face it together. Every step of the way." The Dominion's collapse left a power vacuum that threatened to plunge the city into chaos. Opportunistic factions emerged, each vying for control. Elijah knew that without strong leadership, the city's fragile hope would be crushed under the weight of ambition and greed. The resistance organized community meetings, drawing people from every neighborhood to discuss the path forward. Elijah stood before the crowd in the church hall, his voice calm but firm. "We've fought to tear down a system that thrived on division and oppression," he began. "Now we have the chance to build something new. But it's not up to me, or the resistance, it's up to all of us. The crowd erupted in applause, their faith in Elijah evident. He had become more than a leader, he was a symbol of their resilience. As weeks turned into months, the community began to heal. Schools reopened, businesses flourished, and the city's spirit was reborn. Elijah worked tirelessly, not as a leader of the resistance, but as a neighbor, a father, and a friend. One evening, he stood on a makeshift stage in the town square, addressing a crowd larger than any he had seen before. Lena and Jamal stood beside him, their faces glowing with pride. "This journey has been painful," Elijah said, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "We've lost so much, but we've gained something priceless: unity. Together, we've proven that no force, no tyranny, can break the will of a people determined to be free." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a chorus of hope and determination. As Elijah stepped down from the stage, Jamal tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, are we going to be okay now?" Elijah knelt to meet his son's eyes. "We'll be better than okay, son. We'll be free. Thank you for joining this journey of courage, resistance, and triumph against all odds." Elijah's story reminds us that change starts with a single spark of determination. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What inspired you most about Elijah's fight for freedom? Like this story if it resonated with you and gave you hope. Share it with others who need a reminder that unity can conquer all. Subscribe for more powerful stories that shed light on the fight for justice and equality. Together, we can amplify these voices and fuel the fire for change. Let's keep the conversation alive.